Hello, everyone. My name is Sheila Barrett Carroll, and I am a graphic designer with the North Carolina Historical Research and Publications Office in the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Thank you for your time and thank you for joining us. I would love to introduce you to author of Longneedle, a young reader's book, Anne Runyon, and park ranger Nancy Williamson. Before we go on, I would like to introduce you to both of them and give you a little bit of background about Anne and Nancy. Anne Runyon was born in Washington, D.C. She spent her summers on Ocracoke Island in North Carolina, and that nurtured her love for the natural world. Her family inspired her to be an artist. She earned her BA in studio art from Carleton College and studied design and children's illustration in the Curlin collection while earning her MA from the University of Minnesota. She and her husband moved to North Carolina in 1982, and their son was born and grew up here. Anne is a freelance illustrator and author. She works on paper with ink, watercolor, and colored pencil, creating illustrations for environmental publications and exhibits, and writes and illustrates children's books, creates woodcut prints, and designs paper sculptures, craft activities. North Carolina Plays a Closer Look, edited by Lawrence S. Early, illustrated with her detailed habitat drawings. Longneedle is a song of praise for the environment. Now I would like to introduce Williamson. Nancy Williamson was born and raised in Illinois. Her family's travels in her for nature, and particularly the annual trips that they took at Chain of Lakes State Park in Indiana, where she spent every summer attending ranger-led nature programs, hiking, canoeing, riding her bike, and becoming an Indiana junior ranger and junior Hoosier Hoosier ecologist. She earned her BA in biology at Albion College in Michigan, while also being at the school's nature center. After graduating, she spent 4 years working seasonal jobs around the country, teaching at different nature centers, parks, camp, and environmental education centers. Nancy moved to North Carolina with her husband. He had a teaching job. And just by luck, Weymouth Woods Sandhills Nature Preserve was right down the road. Nancy is now a park ranger and head of educational programming at Weymouth Woods, and has been teaching and sharing her love of nature and longleaf pines with visitors for over 10 years. When not in uniform, Nancy loves traveling with her 2 children and is hoping to repeat the cycle with her little outdoor explorers. So with that said, let's segue into talking about Longneedle and the longleaf pines. Anne, can you explain your love of longneedle pines?
I can try. Thank you very much. Those are nice introductions. Well, I first saw longleaf pines in the Green Swamp on a trip back in I was going to say the date that my that my book begins, but back in, I can't remember the date, but anyway, a long time ago, and it was just beautiful. We saw the savannah there, and then later, after working on a number of projects with the Wildlife Commission and others, I learned more about the longleaf pine, and I learned how really lacking our schools, our libraries were in books about longleaf pines, which is our valuable and much uh, lost pine forest that spread all along the coast of the eastern seaboard, from Virginia down to Texas. It was a vast acres of these beautiful longleaf pines, and people have forgotten because they've been lost. And there are lots of books in our libraries and homes about the diversity of the beautiful rainforests and how many plants and animals live there, but very few, none that I know of, about the plants and animals that grow right here in North Carolina, in our longleaf forests. And so I thought, well, it would be really good to write a children's book about our longleaf forests. And because the little trees, and Sheila, you could bring up a picture of the little sprout, and then a picture maybe of the cover of the book of Longneedle. These beautiful Longneedle trees, we don't know much about them, and so I wanted to write a story about the life of one of these little trees. And I worked for many years learning about it, and I came up with my first book, which was called Grayson of Savannah, and I made a little mock-up here, and I kept working on it, and eventually wrote the book that has been published. The image you see on the screen is a little sprout of a long needle. When they first come out, they're 3 needles, and then there are 6 needles, and then it keeps increasing, and they get bigger and bigger. And there's a picture that Sheila can show of the little grass stage with a snake underneath it. It grows into a little tiny, cute fellow that looks like it looks like a clump of grass, but the picture I'm thinking of has a little scarlet snake around it. Anyway, it's a beautiful tree, and this is a picture that's at the beginning, the introductory picture in my book. And this is the snake and the little grass stage longleaf pine. This is only about 2 years old, but they can stay at this stage looking like a clump of grass for 10 years, a long time, before they start growing up tall to look like a pine tree, and which is what it's doing on the cover art for the book. If Sheila could show that, that would be good.
Sure. Sorry, I'm going to have to scroll through. Oops, there we go.
That's when it gets singed by a fire, and
right.
the needles will fall off, and then miraculously it'll keep growing up once it gets enough sunshine. And this is the cover of the book, the art on the cover, and you can see a couple of the beautiful flowers that grow in the savannas and the longleaf pine forests, and a fox squirrel who has dug up a special mycorrhizal fungi called a rhizopogon that connects with the roots of the pine tree. And it's just a beautiful place. And I wanted to tell the story of how this little tree grows and its relationship to the plants and animals in the savannas and in the dry longleaf hills, in the Sandhills and out on the coastal plain.
So Nancy, can I ask you to provide a brief overview of Weymouth Woods Sandhills Nature Center?
Sure. So Weymouth Woods is part of the state park system. We're actually a little bit different than the rest of the state parks in North Carolina, though. We are considered a state natural area, and we were actually the very first state natural area. So in 1963, we became North Carolina State Park's first state natural area. And at that point, I think they kind of didn't know what to do with us, which is why our name is actually Weymouth Woods Sandhills Nature Preserve, instead of saying that it's part of the state at all. It was kind of a new thing. All of the parks across the state are focused on protecting what important natural resource that they have, but a lot of them also focus a lot on the recreation provided. Camping, you know, the big reservoirs have lakes that people can go boating on and things like that. But here at Weymouth Woods, we're really focused on conservation of the longleaf pine forest and educating people about it. That's really our biggest thing. And we're not big. We have 930 acres. We're in Southern Pines, and you know, we're not huge, but we do have some very significant things here. We have some of the rare plants and animals that live in the longleaf pine forest, and we feel pretty lucky because one of our tracts of land is an old growth tract, which means it's never been cut. So we have trees over there that are 300-400 years old, and as far as we know, we have what is currently the oldest living longleaf pine tree. I always forget the age, 472 or 473 right now. It's kind of hard to keep track, but it's old and really special. It's you know, I am a little biased, but I think our park is pretty cool. I've learned so much being here just because of the diversity that's here. And I do want to thank Anne too for inviting me to be a part of this, because I know she's seen Longleaf and talked to a lot of people about what a special place it is, and I feel pretty honored that she picked Weymouth Woods to highlight along with her book. So I want to thank you for that.
You're one of the people who introduced me to the oldest tree and the champion tree. You didn't mention the champion tree that's also on the special tract. Just impressive, because before I saw those, I've seen the younger trees which grow more widely across the state, some of which are 250 years old, like the one that's on the introductory page, that the fallen log. That was what, you know, sort of I began the book with, and it's just it's a beautiful habitat.
Agreed.
So, Anne, I have the photo of the illustration up right now.
Oh, okay.
Of the fallen log and the two deer. And if you could, for the viewers, if you could read just the inside cover, just to give our readers an idea of a highlight of what they're in for when they purchase your book through our distributor, UNC Press.
Okay, you mean my sort of introduction to the book?
Yeah, that would be great, because this illustration is on one page, and then your introduction is on the other side. That would be.
This story was inspired by an old longleaf pine in North Carolina's coastal plain, riddled with woodpecker holes, which you can see on that downed log there and on some of the trees in the background. The dead tree lay decaying among living longleaf pines, where red-cockaded woodpeckers maintained an active cluster in the forest. Longneedle is referred to as a she rather than an it. Our language lacks a pronoun for a being, like a pine tree, that is both male and female at the same time.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Anne. Nancy, I learned a lot about longleaf pine forests and Longneedle through Longneedle. And what I remarked about is that Longneedle pines are fire-dependent species, and they need prescribed or controlled burns. I had no idea that was even necessary in order for longleaf pines to thrive. So I wanted you to talk about, and we have a photo that's coming up right here. Here is little Longneedle that is a little crispy because there was a fire caused by nature, And could you go into a little bit of detail and talk about what a fire-dependent species is for young breeders, and talk a little bit about forest management and how that helps these fire dependents thrive?
Sure. So fire is a natural part of almost any plant community that you're going to come across. Anywhere, I mean, lightning strikes can start a natural fire. And so anywhere where you get thunderstorms, basically, you probably have some type of fire that at some point in history would have started natural fires. It's particularly important and frequent in this type of ecosystem. If you think about the summer that we had, so many afternoons where you've got rain and thunderstorms and lightning strikes, and those would have started natural wildfires. And if you think back to before we had roads and before we had, buildings and things we wanted to protect, and before European settlers were even in this area, these wildfires, these lightning started fires could have carried on for a really long time and really far. And they would kind of slowly roll across the landscape until it hit something that would stop it, either a heavy rainstorm or a creek, or something that would put it out, other than hitting a road or people. So the plants and the animals in this community, and again, any plant community where you have that situation, things are going to adapt and become used to that. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to survive. So, you either adapt or you're gone. So Longleaf in particular has some really, really interesting adaptations to survive the fire, but it doesn't even just survive it, it thrives in it. One of the things that's really important with fire is that it kind of clears the way for longleaf to grow. If you take fire out of the equation, you have a lot of species that can grow up and kind of shade everything out. So you might have hardwoods that aren't fire resistant, like oak trees and maple trees and sweet gum trees. Without fire around, those things would grow up and they would have a very thick canopy and they would shade everything. Longleaf, young longleaf must have a lot of sunlight. And so if you don't have fire, you can't have the young longleaf growing. Fires also help put nutrients back into the soil. It's kind of like the rapid way of recycling nutrients, especially because longleaf tend to grow in these sandy soils. Our whole coastal plain is mostly sandy soils. The Sandhills where I am, we have sandy soils here, and the longleaf trees are good at growing in the sand. They can do that, but it also means that the nutrient levels are pretty low. So fires kind of help recycle everything that's on the ground and put those nutrients back into the ground fairly quickly. So not only opening up the canopy, but recycling those nutrients. Those things are extremely important. And without that, you just can't have a longleaf pine forest. Most of what we see around here is the result of, or not here in the park, but in areas where we don't have longleaf anymore. What you see are usually trees that are not tolerant of fire that have taken over. So in areas where you're near buildings, or that aren't a nice little nature preserve, that aren't being actively managed, which I'll talk about in a second, what you usually see are the things that have taken over. So like the shade tolerant and quick growing loblollies that move in very quickly into a place, or the oak trees, or like I said, the maple trees and the sweet gum trees, all those things that don't survive well in a fire. They're not fire adapted and can grow in shadier environments. So now, because our landscape is so fragmented, we don't just get lucky enough that lightning strikes right in our park, or right in these areas where we have habitat left to manage. We don't usually get lucky enough for lightning to strike right there, start a wildfire, and it burns right up to the edge very nicely and neatly. That just, that's not how it works anymore. And so we conduct controlled or prescribed burns to help reintroduce that fire into the landscape, since it doesn't just easily travel where it needs to be anymore. I don't know if you want me to go into any further detail, but that's kind of the basics.
Yeah, I want to add one thing. My impression is that before European settlement cut down, changed the landscape so much, the longleaf pine forest did extend all across the coastal plain in the sandy soils, as Nancy said, because these trees, the pines, are well adapted to making do with the mineral-rich but not humus-rich soil. But throughout the landscape, because the fires were sort of sporadic and there'd be one that would come in an area and stop at a river one year, and then, maybe another fire would come back again 7 years later, but there would be patches that didn't get burned. And so the plants and animals that were chased out by the fire or killed by the fire could exist in a neighboring patch of land, and so they could move back in and reestablish themselves in the fire scorched land. And at the same time, there are places where the fires didn't come for a number of years, and so things like the loblollies and then later the oaks and maples and things could grow up and get big enough and strong enough, especially some of the oaks, so that if a fire came through again, many of them could keep living. And so you'd get sort of a varied mosaic of different plants, communities across the coastal plains. It wasn't just entirely longleaf pine. There was a mixture, but longleaf pine was the dominant species that survived when fire could roam across the plains. And that's quite an amazing thing to imagine, how different. If you walk through Weymouth Woods and close your eyes and imagine that the whole coastal plain looked a lot like Weymouth Woods, where there are some areas of hardwoods and swamps, and then there are areas where it's just all longleaf. It's amazing, and that's something I wanted to get kids to think about and know.
Thanks for adding that too, because that is one of the reasons we have so much diversity in the longleaf forest, is because there is this mosaic where you have, maybe you have these dry upland areas that burn possibly annually, but maybe every 2 or 3 years. And then these low, swampy areas might burn every 5 to 10 years. So different things are going to be allowed to grow, like you said. So yeah, that's really one of the most amazing things about this area, I think, is that it's not consistent throughout. It's very variable. So thanks for adding that in there.
Well, this leads me, I've shared a screen of the fire illustration or of them in Longneedle, and this is a beautiful illustration by Anne and Nancy. I'm going to pull up another illustration right here. And this is of the underground connections and some of the native plant and animal life. So, Anne and Nancy, if you could talk about, they're mentioned in the book, Amanita, mycorrhizal, these are big words for little ones, but it does bear time to think about this and explain these interconnections above the ground and below. What are these and why are they important? So if I'll let two of you decide who wants to go, but I think these are really beautiful illustrations, and it helps the reader understand that there is something else going on below their feet.
You can go ahead, Anne.
Okay, I'll start. Just briefly, one of the things is that, green plants like the longleaf pine and this little one here with the green needles, they gather energy from the sun, and using their green chlorophyll, they manufacture sugars and things for energy so that they can grow. Well, the fungi, like the mushrooms here that are shown, and these are one of the amanita mushrooms, I believe that's what that one is. Anyway, they don't have any chlorophyll, and so they need to get their food from dead wood or from uh, sometimes a living tree or plant, or sometimes from an animal carcass, a whole bunch of things that fungi can grow on. Uh, and so in this case, the long needle's roots, the main root goes down, the taproot goes down into the ground and makes holds on and makes it sturdy. And then there are lateral roots that go out, and then there are little teeny root hairs also that go out into the soil, and they try to absorb water and nutrients from the soil, minerals and things that they need to add to the sugars that they've gotten from the sun and grow. But the soils in the sandy soils don't have a whole lot of stuff, and in fact, many soils don't. The roots don't have enough little rootlets out there to really gather up as much as they need. And so the fungus will attach itself to the ends of the roots. There's a special sort of, I forget what it's called, but a little end of the tip of the root, which will let the fungus kind of go in and connect to the tree. And then the fungus sends out all that white stuff that you see in the illustration. Those are little threads of hyphae. They're called hyphae, and they go into little crevices in the soil that the rootlets can't reach, and they collect water and minerals, and they take those back and they give them to the roots of the pine tree or the other tree. Other plants do this, and then the pine tree gives them the sugar, the sap. And so they have this mutualistic exchange of things that each of them has harvested from the sun and from the soil, and they help each other grow. And one of the amazing things that has been learned is that not only do these mycorrhizal, they're called mycorrhizal fungi, which means that the fungi and the roots connect together and they are beneficial. They have a partnership that's helpful to each other. Some of these mycorrhizal hyphae, the little threads, will connect with other hyphae or other trees. And so that you'll get this great chain, this underground web of chemicals and water going back and forth between different pine trees and feeding each other, helping each other. So if the little longneedle grows in a place that doesn't have enough water or something, some of the older longneedles that maybe are doing better can send some nutrients to the little one and nurture it. This research that I'm referring to was done out in British Columbia a number of years ago, and I don't think people are doing the same research here in Weymouth Woods and other places, but the interactions between the mycorrhizal fungi and the pine trees is evident in the mushrooms that you can find on the forest floor. And there are quite a few species in Weymouth Woods that are connected to pine trees and help them.
Yeah, I think one of the, I remember reading about the rhizopogon mushrooms. They actually, the fruiting bodies of the mushrooms are different than the amanitas, where they grow underground actually. I remember reading about those pretty early on when I first started working here and thinking how fascinating it was, because not only are they mycorrhizal with the tree roots, but they also have this interaction with the fox squirrels, because you mentioned before, in that picture where the fox squirrel has dug up one of those underground mushrooms and
Oh,
eating
hold on, I have it. Hold on.
it.
I'm,
Yeah, that's
I'm,
that's such
I'm
an
working
amazing
on it. Hang on.
relationship.
It's kind of, I'm sorry, it froze up.
That's okay.
I looked at it.
But basically, I mean, once we get that image, we can really picture it. But
Wait a
when
minute.
there we
It
go.
was-
Oh, that's good. Perfect.
There it is. Okay.
So
Not-
oops, I'm seeing a
not-
nuthatch right now.
There we go.
So
Okay.
these underground mushrooms, when the squirrel digs them up and eats them, they don't actually digest the spores. So when they eliminate, they're actually depositing the spores back into the soil somewhere else. So then essentially the squirrel ends up being the mode of transportation for these mushrooms to get to other trees. So the tree benefits obviously because it gets those mycorrhizal relationships, but then the squirrel benefits too because it's getting food. So there's so many links like this in the longleaf ecosystem. I mean, I feel like I could probably learn a new connection like that so specific every day for the rest of my career, and I still probably wouldn't understand all of the unique and little intricate connections that there are. It's just amazing, and this is one really cool example of that.
Yeah, and this is an example of if this area burned. Now these mushrooms grow underground, and so they're sort of protected from the fire, but that squirrel is one of the carriers of the spores that can take it, across town, sort of, and take it away from a place that might get burned. And in the other picture, there were some little snails and slugs that were eating the spores of the mushrooms, and they also will travel off and in their feces leave behind the spores for those mushrooms to spread. So it's just amazing. There's so many connections. It's really neat.
So moving away from the natural area and the local animals, plants and animals, humans were also using longleaf pines for naval stores. And could you please explain naval stores briefly? What are naval stores? Why were they used, and how does longleaf pines come into play? And
Sure.
while you're doing that, for our viewers, pardon me, I'm having a few little technical difficulties with sharing screen images, so bear with me. Thank you.
Well, first of all, naval stores are the products that are harvested from longleaf pine and other pine trees, and they were used on wooden ships, and the products were wood, the timber, the trees themselves, and then also resin, which is the amazing product that pines and other conifers make to protect themselves. It's not the same as sap, which is what the mycorrhizal fungi were tapping into, and that has sugars in it. The resin is this sort of sticky stuff that if you cut a pine tree, it sort of oozes out. Well, back in the early days of the colonial development, the colonies were sort of indebted to England, and they had to send products back to England that were valuable, and naval stores became the most important, one of the most important ways they could pay their dues to England. And the naval stores were used for the Royal Navy and for England to sell to other countries. Lumber is just simply cutting down trees, and you cut them and plane them into beams and boards and planks. And the tall, straight longleaf pines were perfect for making very sturdy, strong masts, because longleaf pines have a very dense heartwood in them, so they're very, very strong. And people today use them for telephone poles. And then the resin was extracted and used in a couple different ways. And the earliest, or the first use that brought a lot of money to the colonies was extracting tar, making tar from the trees. And to make tar, you gather up dead wood, dead pine wood that's full of resin, of the sticky stuff, and you stack it up in a kind of a slight dished basin. And in this picture here, you can see a completed kiln that has the longleaf pine stacked inside. Then sort of a wall was built around it, and so you have longleaf pine, lighter wood it was called, inside stacked up, and then you have a layer of sort of a fence around it, and then a layer of earth was put over it. And there's some boughs in there to sort of help keep the sand and the soil from getting down into the kiln interior where the wood is stacked. And they would cut holes sort of up at the top of the stack and light it, and then cover up holes so that the fire would burn inside the kiln. They called it the kiln, and it would burn slowly down to the bottom of the pile of the lighter wood, and the tar would be sort of oozed out because it would get hot, and it would come out and come down into the through like a gutter, a wooden gutter, and drain into a pit or a barrel some distance from the kiln, and be collected and then used for painting on the ropes for the ships, the riggings. It's used to make soap and a lot of uses. And then the tar would be taken and put into a big kettle and boiled to make something that was even stickier and harder, called pitch. And pitch was used to put on the hulls of the ship to keep the seawater out, and it also helped to repel the wood-boring mollusks that would get into the ships and keep them from rotting. And sometimes sulfur was mixed in with that too. And then the other product, which also involves the resin of the trees, is turpentine. And to make the turpentine, workers would go out into the longleaf forests, and this began early with the arrival of the early colonists in the 1700s, and in the 1800s, this industry became really big, and merchants and landowners would use slaves and later hired hands to go out in the forest and cut a notch in the tree, a sort of a V in the tree, going each week they'd go back and cut a new one, and these V's would cut and release the sort of like it would allow the resin that's in the tree to sort of ooze down the side of the tree. And if you look at pine trees, you'll see this white kind of sticky resin on them, and it would ooze down, and the person who was collecting it would cut a little sort of hole in the bottom of the tree. I forget what they called it, a box, I guess is what it was called. And this resin would drain down and collect in the box. And every week they'd go back and visit the tree, and they'd scoop out that collected resin, put it in barrels, and send it off to a still where the resin would be, in this process, I'm not completely sure how it works, but but essentially they'd sort of heat up and boil the resin in so that the vapors came off, and they would distill the vapors out into spirits of turpentine. And after they'd finished doing that, there'd be a little bit of stuff in the bottom, which is called rosin, which is very sort of dry and sticky. And people use that on their instruments, fiddle bows. It's also used to make candles and soap and wax and all sorts of things. And the turpentine is used to make paints and medicines. And before, people were using coal, and I'm drawing a blank on it, but the turpentine, the rosin, the pitch, and the tar were essential for maintaining the wooden ships. And does that answer the question?
Certainly does.
Okay.
That was wonderful. So I would like to move to another illustration that Anne has done. And Nancy, I'm going to ask you if you can see the illustration. Here is Longneedle, and Longneedle is a much older, more mature tree. And here you can see up by the tree, it looks a little red up towards the top of the tree. It is called red heart fungus. Nancy, can you describe what red fungus is? And in Longneedle, it mentions that it does have red heart fungus. Do longleaf pines only get red heart fungus, or do other types of pine trees and other types of trees also, can they catch this fungus?
So a lot of trees will get, as trees get older, they can become more susceptible to infections by things like beetle. If they're weakened in some way, they can get beetle infestations, they can get infected by a fungus. Typically it's when there's some kind of opening in the tree. It gets, a lightning strike might leave it open, a branch falling off might leave it open. Now, we just talked about how this resin is supposed to protect the tree from the longleaf if there is damage to the tree. But just like anything, it's not going to be 100% foolproof. And so you might have little spores airborne floating around in the air. And because longleaf pines are what we call self-pruning, so that just means that they drop their lower limbs as they get older, which is actually one of the fire adaptations. They don't need a whole lot of lower limbs that are just going to get damaged by heat. So they tend to drop all those lower limbs and just keep the top crown of the tree. As they drop those limbs, even though the tree does tend to heal itself with this resin kind of oozing out, again, there can be little openings where spores can get in or something like that. So in this particular case, as the trees get older, generally they're already maybe at least 200 years old or so, the red heart fungus or the red heart rot is going to start to put its little hyphae, or that kind of white networky web, that mycelium, into the tree. And it goes all the way into the actual heartwood, which is the center of the tree that is already dead wood. The outer portion of the tree is what's living and that's called the sapwood, and that's what has all of the sugars and water and everything flowing up and down the tree to carry it where it needs to be. But this fungus reaches into the middle and starts to rot out that middle part. It doesn't actively kill the tree, but it does start to decay that middle, and so it gets kind of spongy and pitted and not very strong anymore. So it's not going to directly kill the tree, but it can weaken it a little bit. so that if, we get one of these hurricanes that comes through and really strong, persistent winds, it might weaken the tree to a point where it could snap. The really interesting thing, though, is that this red heart fungus actually paves the way for red-cockaded woodpeckers, which you also see on this illustration, which is an endangered species of woodpecker that needs that red heart fungus to kind of rot out the middle so that these birds can actually excavate cavities in the tree. This is another one of those amazing connections in the longleaf forest. Red-cockaded woodpeckers, which if you ever hear the term RCW, that's what people are talking about, because it takes a really long time to say red-cockaded woodpecker over and over again. So people will shorten it and say RCW. But these RCWs nest almost exclusively in living longleaf pine trees. They will use other pines occasionally, but they definitely prefer, by and large, they prefer longleaf pines, but live longleaf pines. Most woodpeckers are using dead trees because it's easy to tap through dead wood. But the red-cockadeds will use live trees because of the fact that they still have that resin flowing through them. So they build a cavity, and then they will actively, which is just a hole in the tree where they're going to live or where they're going to have their nest. And then they will peck these little holes all around their cavity called resin wells to purposely make the tree ooze that resin. And that protects the whole, that opening for the cavity from predators, from things like rat snakes that can climb up a tree and prey upon the birds and the eggs. But red-cockaded woodpeckers will generally speaking, use trees that have already been infected by heart rot, and it's been started to decay a little bit in the middle, because it's a very, very long process for the birds to excavate these holes in live trees. So what looks on the outside like it might be, something really detrimental to the tree, you're opening up another possibility for a whole species it's the only way that it's going to survive in this ecosystem is by finding these trees that are easier to excavate. And then that opens up these cavities when they're done with them, or if they get kicked out for whatever reason, that opens up a home for so many other things. There are tons of other birds that are cavity nesters. You have lizards that will use it. You'll have, if it's really enlarged, maybe like a screech owl might use it eventually or something like that. So you start with something as simple as a fungus, and it paves the way for this entire this entire road for all these other creatures to use this one cavity because that fungus started to rot out the tree.
Pretty amazing.
Thank you, Nancy. That was great. The next illustration that I would like to show is Longneedle in Anne's story has now, I'll revert or go back to what Nancy was saying about the crevices. This particular illustration, Longneedle is now called a snag. As you can see, old, weathered. And do you want to talk about the snag? And Nancy, if you would like to talk about snags and what kind of animals live in these types of trees?
Well, I'll just say that this illustration is after Longneedle had died, and that's the definition of a snag, is that it's a dead tree that's still standing in the forest. And Nancy, I'm sure you can talk eloquently about all the animals that might take up residence in the snag and the different kind of woodpeckers and things. It's just amazing. It's a good reason to leave dead trees standing in a wood.
That's one thing that's kind of neat about the park. We have an area where one of our prescribed burns got a little hotter than maybe we expected it to. And it killed a few trees, and we do have some mortality sometimes when we burn. But what it's created now, and it's cool because it's right by the visitor center. So we have this patch down the hill from our visitor center where there's probably, 20 something dead trees in a cluster, and people kind of look at it and ask, well, what happened right down there? And we tell them, we have prescribed fire and humidity dropped a little bit, so it got a little hot. But what we have now is almost a continuous run of red-headed woodpeckers and bluebirds and pileated woodpeckers, and we see this diversity. So, not every dead tree is a bad tree. Dead trees are a hugely important part of the ecosystem as well. That's one of the things that's kind of a shame in neighborhoods. We don't want dead trees to fall on our houses, so we cut everything out. But that's one of the many reasons why we lose diversity just in our neighborhoods, because of losing snags. Like I said, so many things are cavity nesters, nuthatches, bluebirds, great crested flycatchers. All of these things need a home too, and these dead trees continue serving those ecosystem services way after their life has passed.
That little squirrel down there, the flying squirrel, likes to get into the snags, and sometimes they'll get into a red-cockaded
Go ahead.
too, and cause a little competition. But yes, there are a lot of animals that use a dead tree, and it's really valuable.
Well, the final illustration that I wanted to show in Anne's book is, but it's not a sad part. It shows the continuation, the circle of life. Longneedle does fall, but her memory continues on. You will see in the illustration that there are 2 seedlings from Longneedle, and they are growing, but there's also other wildlife that also uses Longneedle. So Anne and Nancy, if you would like to talk more about that, certainly more than I know.
Well, I had fun drawing this one because I really love lizards and toads and snakes, and and drawing the male fence lizard up on top of the little leftover branch on Longneedle lying on the ground. They kind of raise themselves up and down. They kind of pump themselves up and down so they can show off that really beautiful blue that they have underneath. And there's an enchanted female down below who's being attracted to the male. And in the story, they mate, and the female lays eggs underneath the old tree, and there's also a little slug coming along because I really like slugs. That's a mantle slug. But Nancy, you can talk more about that process of what the tree gives back, even in death.
Well, yeah, just because it's fallen, it definitely hasn't stopped, serving its purpose. A lot of reptiles are a huge part of the longleaf ecosystem, and there's a lot of things that live here that are, kind of unique to this area. And a dead log is a great place for something to hide in. We also have a lot of amphibians, toads and tree frogs and things like that might use those as a hiding spot. So, it just, again, there's just so many connections. It doesn't just stop with a tree is a tree. A tree ends up, connecting to the mushrooms, to other plants, to the reptiles, to the birds. It just kind of solidifies that point that these trees just, present such an amazing ecosystem with all the connections that it creates in the longleaf forest.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Hello, everybody. And I would like to, this is our final question. Anne and Nancy, can you talk about longleaf pine protection and conservation efforts? And Nancy, can you briefly talk about in April, or every April, there is a Longleaf Pine Festival, and hopefully this year there will be one at Weymouth Woods. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Yeah. So, on a very small scale here at the park, obviously, again, as a state natural area, our focus is preserving longleaf pine. So we try to make sure that we are, getting fire into the landscape, doing the prescribed burning, and really educating people about it so that people are comfortable with prescribed burning, because fire can be kind of a scary thing. And if you're unfamiliar with it, but it's you can't replace it in the longleaf pine ecosystem. You've got to have it. So you've got to figure out a way to get it on the landscape and to make people okay with that so that they understand what's going on. And that's part of what our Party for the Pine Festival does. So starting with the centennial for state parks in 2016, we created a festival to celebrate our old pine tree, but to also celebrate longleaf in general and fire. And so hopefully we'll see what 2021 brings, but when the festival exists, it's just a huge partnership between, us and all the agencies like Forest Service and Nature Conservancy and you name it, we've got tons of conservation people there, and then just local people from the community as well. We have the local fire department come out so kids can sit in a fire truck. We have the Forest Service helicopter come out so the kids can see that aspect of things. And it's really just trying to open up to the community to have them understand what we do, what longleaf is, what fire is, why we use it. And it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun. And then, we're such a small piece. Longleaf used to cover about 90 million acres of the Southeast, like Anne kind of explained in the beginning. 90 million acres was what we started with. We're down to, a fraction of that. Maybe the numbers are kind of varying as conservation efforts, boost the numbers a little bit, but development continues. So we're probably about 3% of that original acreage. And we are just a tiny little 930 acre nature preserve. But we're trying to get that message across so that we can try to have people understand why it's important, and hope that it encourages them to do it on their own land too. A lot of longleaf and a lot of places that could be restored to longleaf are actually on private land. And so we really, as a whole, we rely on private landowners to want to restore longleaf. And even if it's being managed in some way for timber or raking pine needles and using pine straw, everybody's got to live. We all need an income, and we understand that. But the big idea is to focus on this greater loss that we have of longleaf, because like Anne said, everybody talks about the rainforest and all these places that are in decline, and they are, but we're watching something disappear right before our eyes that we don't even seem to be aware of. And so there's a very large, southeastern widespread, since that's where longleaf grows. And I'll see if I get this acronym right. I think it's called the Longleaf Restoration. Oh, I'm gonna get it wrong. I'm not even gonna try. But it's the whole region initiative to restore longleaf, and it's basically a huge partnership of agencies that are working to find ways to make longleaf restoration make sense for people. It includes cost sharing incentives, things like that, and then a lot of work and education going on about it through a lot of the federal agencies and state agencies and things like that. And it's a huge effort to try and restore. I think the goal is 8 million acres is what they want to get to of restored longleaf pine. And that's a huge goal. And so that's why we kind of need everybody on board, and books like this one are exactly what we need to get everybody on board with this. We don't want to lose the rainforest. We don't want to lose longleaf pine forest. And the more people know about it, that's the way we're going to do it.
Yes, that's really well put. I would add that if you wanted to visit two beautiful places that are open to the public, the first I'd say is to go visit Nancy and at the Weymouth Woods, but also contact the Nature Conservancy and take a trip to one of the preserves that they're working with, the Green Swamp, and there's some others too. But you need to go through the Nature Conservancy and maybe even join the Nature Conservancy so you get updates on what they're doing. But they have some beautiful wet savannas and precosins and things down a little closer to the Atlantic Ocean. So that's a really flat land, and it's a little different from the Sandhills, but the pine trees are there in both places, and we want those forests to keep growing and to get a little bit bigger and to be connected. Now, I don't think we can ever again connect those two habitats together, but places like Fort Bragg, where they do a lot of work with the woodpeckers and the forests and rare butterflies and all sorts of things, you know, it's growing slowly, and if we can just keep educating people and getting people interested, and most of all, go and visit one of these beautiful forests. They're just gorgeous.
Well, Anne and Nancy, thank you so much. And for everybody watching, thank you for your time. If you are interested in purchasing Anne's book, Longneedle, please visit UNC Press. They are our book distributor. And again, thank you so much for your time, and make a trip out when you can to Weymouth Woods. And thank you again. Appreciate it. Thank you.